The envelope had been sitting on the folding table for nearly an hour before anyone found the courage to touch it. It wasn't addressed to the minister, or to the lawyer handling the estate, or even to the family gathered beneath the old maple trees outside the small church overlooking Penobscot Bay. It had only 6 words written across the front in careful blue ink. For Caleb Brooks. Open only after today. Every eye drifted toward the tall black single father, standing a few feet away with one hand resting gently on his 11-year-old daughter Naomi's shoulder. He didn't reach for the envelope immediately. Instead, he knelt to straighten the loose lace on Naomi's sneaker before quietly brushing a strand of hair away from her face. The same calm gesture he'd repeated 1,000 ordinary mornings. Around them, whispers traveled faster than the cold Atlantic wind. He finally came. After all these years. I still can't believe Nolan pulled that stunt back then. Caleb heard every word but answered none of them. He had spent 15 years pretending those whispers no longer mattered, convincing himself that whatever happened during their senior year belonged to another version of his life. Yet standing there beside his oldest friend's grave, surrounded by people who still believed the same story they had believed as teenagers, he realized time had preserved some lies far better than memories. The lawyer stepped forward holding a worn cedar box barely larger than a shoebox. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "this was left specifically for you. Mr. Hayes made me promise no one else would open it." A few people exchanged puzzled looks. Someone quietly muttered that Nolan always loved dramatic gestures. Caleb almost smiled, because that was exactly what everyone had believed back then too. They thought Nolan had dared him. They thought everything that followed had started with a reckless bet between 2 stubborn boys. Even Caleb had believed it. He accepted the box, surprised by how light it felt, as if it carried less weight than the years separating them. Inside rested an old cassette tape, a tarnished silver coin with their graduation year engraved across one side. And the envelope. Nothing else. No explanation. No farewell. Naomi looked up at her father. "Was Mr. Nolan really your best friend?" Caleb stared at the coin without answering. The question sounded simple, yet he no longer knew if he had ever understood the man everyone had buried that morning. His thumb traced the edge of the envelope until he noticed something tucked beneath the flap, a second folded page almost hidden from view. Written in handwriting he recognized instantly. His breathing slowed. The first sentence was only 8 words long, but it shattered the story he had believed for half his life. "Caleb, it was never my bet." Caleb folded the letter before anyone else could read another word. His fingers were steady, but Naomi noticed the tiny pause before he slipped the page back into the envelope. She had seen that pause only once before, the day he packed away her mother's wedding ring after promising himself he would not let grief become the loudest voice in their home. He placed the cedar box beneath his arm, thanked the lawyer with a quiet nod, and waited until the last guest had left the cemetery before walking toward the weathered pickup truck parked beneath the lighthouse road. The silence between father and daughter felt gentle rather than empty. Naomi finally asked, "If he was your best friend, why did we never visit him?" Caleb looked out across the gray water instead of answering. It was the same question he had avoided asking himself for 15 years. On the drive home, the cassette tape rested on the passenger seat beside the silver graduation coin, catching the afternoon sunlight each time the truck rounded a curve along the coast. He remembered buying that coin with Nolan after graduation, each of them joking that they would flip it whenever life became too complicated. Somehow, Nolan's coin had found its way back into the box. Caleb's had disappeared years ago. Was that another coincidence? Or had he forgotten something important? That evening, after Naomi finished her homework at the kitchen table, Caleb carried the cedar box into the garage where old camping gear, dusty cameras, and unopened moving boxes still lined the shelves. He searched until he found a faded plastic storage bin labeled senior year. Inside were yearbooks, newspaper clippings, photographs from cross-country meets, and a cracked disposable camera that had never been developed. Tucked between 2 notebooks lay a folded newspaper article announcing Caleb's acceptance into a prestigious photography program in Oregon. He remembered turning it down after everything that happened. Until that moment, he had never connected the timing. Why had one terrible afternoon changed the direction of his entire future? Naomi wandered into the garage holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She quietly handed one to her father before kneeling beside the box. "You always tell me memories are like photographs," she said. Sometimes you have to look closer. Caleb smiled faintly. His daughter had inherited her mother's habit of saying simple things that somehow carried enormous weight. He picked up one of the notebooks and noticed Nolan's handwriting covering the inside cover. It was not a journal. It was a checklist. Every page listed dates, names, and places from the months leading up to graduation, each entry marked with careful notes as though Nolan had been tracking something only he understood. Several pages had been torn out. One remaining line stopped Caleb cold. If Caleb ever finds this, tell him to ask Coach Donnelly about the doc before believing anyone. Caleb stared at the sentence until the garage seemed strangely smaller around him. Coach Donnelly had died almost 10 years earlier. If Nolan wanted him to ask the coach, then who had been keeping the truth alive all this time? Just as that question settled in his mind, he turned the notebook over and discovered a sealed envelope taped inside the back cover with 3 words written across it in the same unmistakable handwriting. Do not listen. Caleb did not open the sealed envelope. Instead, before sunrise the next morning, he wrapped Nolan's notebook in a clean towel, placed it back inside the cedar box, and drove toward Harborview High School, where the annual scholarship committee was meeting. If Coach Donnelly's name meant anything, the school was the only place left that might still hold a forgotten piece of the past. Naomi sat beside him quietly eating a blueberry muffin, occasionally glancing at the unopened envelope resting between them. She never asked him to break the seal. She knew her father well enough to understand that promises mattered even when the person who made them was no longer alive. As they entered the old brick building, a volunteer hurried through the hallway carrying a stack of framed photographs that suddenly slipped from her arms. Glass did not shatter, but the frames scattered across the polished floor. Caleb handed the cedar box to Naomi without hesitation and knelt to help gather every picture before anyone stepped on them. The volunteer apologized repeatedly, embarrassed that she had delayed the meeting, but Caleb simply smiled and said everyone needed a second pair of hands sometimes. Naomi noticed several committee members watching from the open doorway. Most returned polite smiles. One woman did not. She stood near the conference room with a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm, studying Caleb with measured caution rather than warmth. She was introduced moments later as Grace Whitmore, the attorney overseeing several educational trusts in the county, including one established anonymously years earlier for graduating seniors facing financial hardship. Grace thanked Caleb for helping, but kept looking at the cedar box as though she recognized it. When the committee chair invited him inside after hearing he had once been one of Coach Donnelly's students, Caleb declined. He explained that he was not there for recognition or donations. He only hoped to review any archived coaching records that had not been discarded. The request immediately changed the room. One retired teacher quietly whispered that the files had been scheduled for disposal months earlier. Another insisted nearly everything had already been digitized. Grace remained silent until she finally asked one careful question. Why would someone return after 15 years looking for coaching records instead of memories? Caleb considered inventing an easier answer, but chose honesty instead. Because memories can lie. Paper usually does. Not. The sentence lingered longer than he expected. Grace's guarded expression softened for only a moment before returning. She clearly wanted to believe him, yet something still held her back. The committee chair eventually located a storage key and warned that the basement archive would be closed permanently by the end of the week. Caleb thanked everyone, refusing the offer to move ahead of scheduled appointments even though doing so would have saved him hours. Naomi squeezed his hand after they entered the dim archive room lined with dusty filing cabinets. "You always wait your turn," she whispered. Nolan used to say the same thing. Caleb froze. Naomi frowned, confused. "I have never met him," she added quickly. "I know. It just felt like something he would have said." Caleb slowly opened the cabinet labeled athletics, then found Coach Donnelly's final season. Most folders contained attendance sheets and meet schedules, but one file was noticeably thicker than the others. Tucked inside was a faded marina map with a red circle drawn around an abandoned dock and a yellow sticky note bearing only 4 handwritten words. "Ask Evelyn about Tuesday." Caleb stared at the faded note until the words seemed heavier than the paper itself. Ask Evelyn about Tuesday. His mother had spent 15 years insisting that nothing good could come from reopening old wounds. Yet Nolan had trusted her name with the final trail of clues. Naomi quietly slipped the marina map back into the folder before anyone else entered the archive room. She noticed Grace Whitmore standing outside the half-open door, watching without interrupting. Grace stepped inside only after Caleb closed the cabinet. "Those files are supposed to stay here," she said calmly. Caleb handed the folder back without argument. "Then they should." His answer surprised her. Most people would have hidden the map or photographed every page. Instead, he returned everything exactly as he had found it except the single sticky note, which had detached naturally when he opened the file. Grace studied him for another long moment before saying she had known Nolan only through legal paperwork, but one detail had always bothered her. Nolan updated his estate every year without fail, yet he never changed the instruction that Caleb alone should receive the cedar box. Why would someone expect the same person to come back after so many years? Caleb admitted he did not know anymore. That uncertainty followed him all afternoon as he drove Naomi to her music lesson. While waiting outside the community arts center, he finally called his mother. Evelyn answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful until he quietly asked, "What happened on Tuesday?" The silence that followed stretched so long Caleb thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "Who told you that name?" Caleb looked at the notebook resting on the passenger seat. "Nolan did." Another long silence. Then Evelyn whispered, "Some promises are meant to protect the living, not punish them." Before Caleb could ask another question, she ended the call. Minutes later, a text message appeared from an unknown number. "Do not ask her again. You are already too late." Caleb frowned. Only 3 people knew he planned to speak with Evelyn. Naomi returned carrying her violin case, immediately noticing the tension in his face. She climbed into the truck without asking questions, then pointed toward the windshield. A white envelope had been tucked beneath the wiper blade while he had been on the phone. There was no stamp, no address, only his name written in black ink. Inside was a single photocopy of an old newspaper clipping from their senior year. Someone had circled a sentence in red marker. "Local student declines scholarship after dock incident." Caleb read it twice before realizing something impossible. The article listed the date of the dock incident as Wednesday, but Nolan's note had specifically said Tuesday. If the newspaper had reported the wrong day, then the entire story everyone remembered had been built on a timeline that never made sense. His phone rang again before he could think further. The caller identified herself as Grace Whitmore. Her voice remained composed, but one sentence changed everything. "Mr. Brooks, I just reviewed Nolan's confidential trust records. Someone accessed them less than 2 hours before his funeral, and the only document they opened was the one with your name on it." Grace asked Caleb to meet her the next morning inside the county records office before it opened to the public. She had spent most of the night comparing access logs, trust revisions, and archived legal correspondence, and none of it followed a pattern that made sense. Naomi sat quietly in the waiting area with a sketchbook while Caleb joined Grace in a small conference room overlooking the harbor. Without saying a word, Grace slid 2 identical signatures across the table. One belonged to Nolan's final trust amendment signed 3 months before his death. The other came from a legal waiver filed the week after graduation. They looked identical until Grace pointed to a tiny difference in the way the letter H curved at the end of Hayes. "He signed these himself," she said, "but he wrote one of them with his left hand." Caleb frowned. Nolan had never been left-handed. Grace nodded. "Exactly. Someone wanted that document to look different without making it look false. The waiver contained only one sentence that mattered. Caleb Brooks voluntarily declined all claims related to the dock incident." Caleb stared at the page in disbelief. "I never signed this." Grace believed him immediately because another detail stood out. The witness line contained Coach Donnelly's name, yet the coach's handwriting did not match any other document preserved in the school archives. If both signatures had been manipulated, who had benefited from creating an official version of events? Before Caleb could answer, his phone vibrated with a voicemail from his mother. Her voice trembled more than it had the day before. "Do not come to my house. There is something I should have told you years ago, but someone is asking questions again." The message ended abruptly. Caleb called back, but there was no answer. He left immediately, asking Naomi to remain with Grace until he returned. Grace objected at first, then quietly handed him a small sealed evidence sleeve. Inside was the tarnished graduation coin from Nolan's cedar box. "Look at the edge under bright light," she said. "I think he wanted you to notice something." During the drive, Caleb stopped at a roadside gas station and held the coin beneath the overhead lights. Tiny engraved letters appeared along the rim, almost invisible unless the metal caught the light at exactly the right angle. They spelled 6 words. Locker 21. Tuesday, 8:15. His heart raced. Locker 21 had belonged to Nolan during senior year. Why had Nolan hidden a message where no one would ever think to look? When Caleb reached Evelyn's house, the front porch was empty, but the screen door stood slightly open. His mother was safe inside, packing old family photographs into cardboard boxes as though she had been expecting him. She did not look frightened anymore. She looked tired. Without greeting him, she reached beneath the kitchen table and placed a faded school hall pass in his hand. Across the back, written in Nolan's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "If Caleb remembers Tuesday, he will finally know why Wednesday had to become the lie." Caleb looked up, ready to demand an explanation, but before Evelyn could speak, someone knocked softly on the front door and called his name in a voice he had not heard since graduation. Caleb slowly opened the front door, expecting another stranger with another warning. But instead he found Professor Harold Benton standing on the porch with a weathered leather briefcase clutched tightly against his chest. 15 years had added gray hair and deeper lines to the retired history teacher's face, yet his eyes carried the same quiet kindness Caleb remembered from high school. Before Caleb could speak, Harold held up an old faculty identification card. "I promised Nolan I would never come looking for you unless he could no longer keep that promise himself." Evelyn stepped back without saying a word and invited him inside. Harold placed the briefcase on the kitchen table and carefully removed a thick attendance ledger, several sealed envelopes, and a disposable camera still inside its original evidence bag. Caleb immediately recognized the cracked camera from the storage box in his garage. He had believed it had never been developed. Harold gently shook his head. "It was developed. Nolan asked me to hide the photographs." Caleb's pulse quickened as Harold spread the pictures across the table. None of them showed a reckless challenge between two teenagers. Instead, every photograph captured ordinary moments from Tuesday afternoon, nearly 24 hours before the event everyone had talked about for years. Caleb and Nolan were standing beside the abandoned marina dock speaking with Coach Donnelly, pointing toward loose boards and damaged railings while another student measured sections with a tape measure. The date stamp printed on the back confirmed Tuesday. Suddenly, the newspaper clipping, the handwritten note, and the engraved coin all fit together. The famous dock incident had never begun on Wednesday. The most important part had happened the day before. Harold then opened the attendance ledger and pointed to one overlooked entry. Coach Donnelly had excused Caleb from final practice at exactly 8:15 Tuesday morning to help document unsafe conditions around the marina for a community repair request. That explained the hidden message engraved into the coin. Caleb had been there legally, not because of some reckless dare. Naomi quietly studied one photograph, where Nolan stood slightly behind Caleb, smiling while holding a clipboard instead of laughing or encouraging danger. "He was protecting you," she whispered. Harold nodded but immediately added, "Only part of the truth." Grace arrived moments later after receiving Harold's message. She reviewed every photograph, then compared them with the forged legal waiver. Her expression changed completely. "Someone needed the world to believe this was an impulsive mistake," she said softly. "Because if people learned what really happened on Tuesday, the waiver would collapse and several official decisions made afterward would also fall apart." Caleb suddenly realized why Nolan had accepted years of blame without defending himself. Speaking the truth would not only clear his own name, it would expose someone else who had built an entire career upon the false story. Harold reached into the bottom of the briefcase and removed one final sealed envelope, marked in Nolan's handwriting. Unlike the others, this one carried a second instruction beneath Caleb's name. "Open only if you are willing to forgive before you understand everything." Caleb held the envelope in both hands while everyone around the table remained silent. If he broke the seal, there would be no returning to the life he had believed for 15 years, and somewhere beyond that fragile paper waited the one name capable of changing every memory forever. Caleb broke the seal with slow, careful hands, almost expecting another clue instead of the truth, But the first page inside was not addressed to him alone. It began with the words, "To everyone who believed I stayed silent because I was guilty." The room fell completely still as Harold quietly read the letter aloud. Nolan explained that the damaged dock had been reported on Tuesday morning, and Caleb had volunteered to photograph it before the town approved repairs. Late that afternoon, another student wandered onto the unsafe platform alone. Nolan reached the scene first, convinced the quickest way to prevent panic was to move everyone away before rumors spread. By Wednesday morning, the story had already changed. Students were repeating that two friends had made a foolish challenge, and each new version buried the truth a little deeper. Caleb searched every line for the confession he had expected, but it never came. Instead, Nolan described making a different decision. He had agreed never to correct the rumors because exposing the real sequence of events would force another family to relive a painful mistake involving their own child, who had unknowingly entered the restricted area before anyone else arrived. That family had already lost enough through public judgment, and Nolan refused to let another teenager carry that weight forever. Grace quietly lowered the letter. Suddenly, every legal document, every altered date, and every year of silence pointed toward the same conclusion. Nolan had protected more than Caleb. He had protected strangers who never realized the cost of his kindness. Caleb felt years of anger begin to collapse beneath the weight of a sacrifice he had never imagined. Yet one question remained. If Nolan had accepted blame voluntarily, who had forged the waiver and changed the official record? Harold opened the final folder from his briefcase and removed minutes from a town council meeting held 6 months after graduation. A marina redevelopment project worth millions of dollars had depended on proving the dock incident resulted from reckless student behavior instead of neglected maintenance. If the truth had emerged, the project would have faced costly delays and public scrutiny. Grace immediately understood why the timeline had been rewritten. Someone did not simply protect a reputation, she said quietly. They protected an entire decision that affected this town for years. Naomi looked at her father, waiting to see whether he would demand names or revenge. Instead, Caleb folded Nolan's letter with the same care Nolan had shown writing it. "He carried this so nobody else had to," he said. "I will not dishonor that by chasing anger." Grace watched him in silence. For the first time, every doubt she had carried about the quiet man standing before her disappeared. She saw someone choosing dignity over outrage even after discovering 15 years of unnecessary guilt. That choice shifted the room more powerfully than any accusation could have. Just as Caleb prepared to place Nolan's letter back into the envelope, a smaller folded page slipped onto the table unnoticed until Naomi picked it up. Unlike every other note, this one was written in a child's uneven handwriting. She turned it over slowly, and the signature at the bottom caused Harold to lose the color in his face because the name belonged to the one person everyone had believed was never there that Tuesday. Naomi carefully unfolded the small note while every adult in the room instinctively leaned closer. The childish handwriting belonged to Owen Mercer, the quiet 12-year-old boy who had wandered onto the damaged dock 15 years earlier before anyone realized he was there. Beneath his name was a simple sentence that seemed almost too innocent to carry so much weight. "Mr. Nolan told me not to tell anyone because he said grown-ups would blame themselves forever." Harold closed his eyes as memories returned all at once. Owen had been too young to understand the meetings, the legal papers, or the rumors that followed. He had simply believed the older boy who had comforted him. Caleb slowly sat down, overwhelmed by the realization that Nolan had never protected a secret to preserve his own image. He had protected a frightened child from carrying guilt into adulthood. Grace quietly placed the forged waiver beside Owen's note. One document had been created to protect reputations. The other had been written to protect a heart. The difference was impossible to ignore. Within days, Grace petitioned the town council to reopen the historical record, not to punish anyone, but to correct the official timeline using the photographs, attendance ledger, Nolan's letter, and the recovered notes. The council agreed unanimously. At the next public meeting, the mayor acknowledged that the long-accepted version of events had been incomplete and formally restored Nolan's role as the student who first reported the unsafe dock and helped prevent a greater tragedy through calm judgment and quiet courage. No speeches praised heroics. No one searched for someone to shame. The truth itself became enough. After the meeting, several former classmates approached Caleb one by one. Some apologized for repeating stories they had never questioned. Others admitted they had always sensed something did not fit, but had been too young to challenge what everyone believed. Caleb accepted every apology with the same gentle grace Nolan had shown years before. Naomi watched her father shake each hand without bitterness, and she finally understood why he always taught her that forgiveness did not erase the past. It simply refused to let the past decide the future. Grace remained near the back of the room until everyone else had gone. She handed Caleb a newly framed copy of one of the recovered photographs. Instead of showing rumors or mistakes, it captured two teenage friends standing beside the weathered dock with clipboards in their hands, determined to help their community before anyone else noticed the danger. "This is how people should remember him," she said. Quietly, Caleb smiled for the first time since opening the cedar box. "No," he answered. "This is how people should remember both of us." That afternoon, father and daughter walked together to Nolan's grave overlooking the bay. Caleb placed the framed photograph against the headstone, while Naomi rested the silver graduation coin beside it for a moment before slipping it gently back into her father's hand. "You should keep it now," she whispered. Caleb looked across the calm water where everything had begun, feeling that the years of silence had finally lost their power. Yet as they turned to leave, he noticed one last unopened item resting inside the cedar box, hidden beneath the false wooden bottom that none of them had discovered before. Caleb carefully lifted the false wooden panel from the bottom of the cedar box and found one final item resting beneath it. Not another secret capable of changing history, but a worn photograph folded around a small brass key. The picture showed two teenage boys standing outside the old post office on graduation week, each pretending to look serious while barely hiding their laughter. On the back, Nolan had written, "Some things are only meant to be opened after peace finds you." The brass key matched a rented post office box that had remained untouched for more than 15 years because the prepaid lease had quietly renewed through an anonymous trust. Grace helped Caleb complete the paperwork the following afternoon, and together with Naomi, they unlocked the narrow metal door. Inside was no fortune, no shocking confession, and no hidden evidence against anyone. There was only a carefully organized collection of letters addressed to different moments Caleb might one day reach. One was marked, "When Naomi starts asking difficult questions." Another read, "When you finally forgive yourself." A third simply said, "For your first exhibition." Caleb smiled through grateful tears because Nolan had somehow believed in a future his friend could not yet imagine. The final envelope contained a single sentence. "The greatest photograph you will ever take is the one that reminds someone they were loved." Weeks later, Caleb opened a small photography exhibit inside the Community Arts Center where Naomi had practiced her violin for years. The walls displayed restored images from the harbor, the school, the repaired dock, and ordinary families whose quiet acts of kindness often went unnoticed. At the center of the room stood the recovered photograph of two young friends holding clipboards instead of trophies. Beneath it was a simple caption, "Truth sometimes arrives long after judgment." Visitors paused longer at that picture than any other. Some recognized themselves in the background. Others recognized the danger of believing the easiest story instead of the truest one. Evelyn attended the exhibit with peaceful eyes, finally free from the promise she had carried for so many years. Harold smiled as former students thanked him for preserving memories that deserved another chance. Grace watched Naomi proudly explain every photograph to visitors, realizing that the greatest legacy Nolan had left behind was not a corrected record, but a father and daughter choosing compassion over resentment. Before leaving, Caleb slipped the silver graduation coin into Naomi's hand. She looked surprised until he gently closed her fingers around it. "Keep it," he said, "not because it reminds us of what we lost, but because it reminds us that character is what remains when nobody knows the whole story." As they stepped outside, Naomi noticed the same afternoon sunlight reflecting across Penobscot Bay that had shimmered on the cedar box the day of the funeral. This time there were no whispers waiting for them, no unanswered accusations, and no hidden burden left to carry. There was only a quiet walk home beside the water, where a father's steady hand rested gently on his daughter's shoulder, just as it had before the first envelope was ever opened. Except now they both understood why that simple act had always mattered most. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.